Welcome, friends. This is A Course in Miracles, Palm Beach Study Group. We're on Chapter 11, Section 4. In the book, it's in the text on page 200. The Inheritance of God's Son. Never forget that the sonship is your salvation, for the sonship is yourself. As God's creation, it is yours, and belonging to you, it is His. Yourself does not need salvation, but your mind needs to learn what salvation is. You are not saved from anything, but you are saved for glory. Glory is your inheritance given you by your Creator that you might extend it. If you hate part of yourself, all your understanding is lost because you are looking on what God created as yourself without love. And since what He created is part of Him, you are denying Him His place in His own altar. So, because we are the Son of God, the child of God, we are our own salvation, and we don't need to be saved from anything, but we need to be saved for the glory of God, which is our inheritance, which our Father gave to us by extending Himself, and we are expected to extend ourselves in love to continue the creation. But if we hate any part of ourselves, and that means hating somebody else, because we're all one and there's only one of us. So if we hate anybody, we hate ourselves. And if we do that, then we're not in love. And so then we need to be saved. And since what He created, which is us, is part of Him, we are part of Him, we are denying Him His place in His own altar, and His own altar is ourselves. The kingdom of heaven is within us. Any questions, comments? Paragraph 2. Could you try to make God homeless and know that you are at home? Can the Son deny the Father without believing that the Father has denied Him? God's laws hold only for your protection, and they never hold in vain. What you experience when you deny your Father is still for your protection. For the power of your will cannot be lessened without the intervention of God against it. And any limitation on your power is not the will of God. Therefore, look only to the power that God gave to save you, remembering that it is yours because it is His, and join with your brothers in His peace. the Course likes to ask a lot of rhetorical questions, as they began this section with. Could you try to make God homeless? Can the Son deny the Father without believing that the Father has denied him? They ask these questions, but the answer is no. Again, so that last sentence, remember that his power is your power because we are him, and we need to join with our brothers in peace because we're in his peace. When we say there's only one of us, yes, that's the sonship is one, but remember, we're also one with the Father, with God. So there's only one of us altogether. God and us are one. We are one with one another. So it all comes back to the oneness, which is why the Course is a teaching of non-duality. Ego is the teaching of duality, us and them, black and white, right and wrong. That's the ego, duality. But the Course is teaching oneness, non-duality. There's only one. There is no separation. And it is in that understanding that we find total peace and love. Any questions, comments? Number 3, your peace lies in its limitlessness. Limit the peace you share, and yourself must be unknown to you. Every altar to God is part of you, because the light he created is one with him. Would you cut off a brother from the light that is yours? You would not do so if you realize that you can darken only your own mind. As you bring him back, so will you return. That is the law of God for the protection of the wholeness of his Son. So again, in sentence 3, every altar to God, that means every person. Everybody is part of you. Every altar to God, every person is part of you. Because the light he created, which is us, is one with him. Again, the oneness. It always goes back to the oneness. So if we cut anybody out of peace and love, we're cutting ourselves out. Paragraph 4. Only you can deprive yourself of anything. Do not oppose this realization, for it is truly the beginning of the dawn of light. Remember also that the denial of this simple fact takes many forms, and these you must learn to recognize and to oppose steadfastly, without exception. This is a crucial step in the reawakening. The beginning phases of this reversal are often quite painful, for as blame is withdrawn from without, there is a strong tendency to harbor it within. It is difficult at first to realize that this is exactly the same thing, for there is no distinction between within and without. We create our own reality. Only we can deprive ourselves of anything. God will not deprive us of anything. But remember that the denial of this simple fact takes many forms, and that's because the ego likes to split and dissect and create many, many different versions. And when we're in the ego world, there's all different kinds of ways of depriving ourselves: selfishness, hatred, jealousy, anger, uh, putting people down, disrespect, racism, just all kinds of ways that the ego has created for us to deprive ourselves by depriving others, by thinking of others in any negative form. There's only one of us. So if we think of anybody in the negative, we're thinking of ourselves. So we're depriving ourselves. And we need to recognize all of these different forms and to oppose them steadfastly without exception. And that's something we have to practice and just, be vigilant about and keep doing it over and over and over again every time we catch ourselves, to stop ourselves and transform it. Turn hatred to love, turn anger to peace, turn racism to acceptance and respect. There is no distinction between within and without. Yes, Ed. Do you have a question? Okay. David, are you good?
This kind of answers the question I asked you before we started.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
And remember how I said probably the answer's in the text coming up. And it's there.
And there it is. All righty then, let's go on to paragraph 5. If your brothers are part of you and you blame them for your deprivation, you are blaming yourself. And you cannot blame yourself without blaming them. That is why blame must be undone, not seen elsewhere. Lay it to yourself, and you cannot know yourself. For only the ego blames at all. Self-blame is therefore ego identification. And as much as ego defense, and as much as ego defense as blaming others. Let's say that again. Self-blame is therefore ego identification and as much an ego defense as blaming other. You cannot enter God's presence if you attack his Son. When his Son lifts his voice in praise of his Creator, he will hear the voice for his Father. Yet the Creator cannot be praised without his Son, for their glory is shared and they are glorified together. It's just another way of saying that there's only one of us, and whatever we do unto others, we do unto ourselves and to God. Paragraph 6. Christ is at God's altar, waiting to welcome his Son. But come wholly without condemnation, for otherwise you will believe that the door is barred and you cannot enter. The door is not barred, and it is impossible that you cannot enter the place where God would have you be. But love yourself with the love of Christ, for so does your Father love you. You can refuse to enter, but you cannot bar the door that Christ holds open. Come unto me, who hold it open for you. For while I live, it cannot be shut, and I live forever. God is my life and yours, and nothing is denied by God to his Son. Number 7. At God's altar, Christ waits for the restoration of himself in you. God knows his Son as wholly blameless as himself, and he is approached through the application through the appreciation of his Son. Christ waits for your acceptance of him as yourself and of his wholeness as yours. For Christ is the Son of God, who lives in his Creator and shines with his glory. Christ is the extension of the love and the lovingness of God, as perfect as his Creator and at peace with him. So this gives a very clear definition of the word Christ. For Christ is the Son of God. Christ is the extension of the love. Paragraph 8. Blessed is the Son of God, whose radiance is of his Father, and whose glory he wills to share as his Father shares it with him. There is no condemnation in the Son, for there is no condemnation in the Father. Sharing the perfect love of the Father, the Son must share what belongs to him, for otherwise he will not know the Father or the Son. Peace be unto you, who rest in God, and in whom the whole sonship rests. we need to accept our innocence. We need to stop blaming ourselves. We need to stop playing ego's games and just embrace the oneness of the Christ, the oneness of the Father, the oneness that we are. And in that oneness is all peace and love, joy, and knowledge and wisdom. Any questions? Any discussion?
I have a comment in paragraph 7. To me, that seems like a positive affirmation.
Which sentence? The whole paragraph?
I'm sorry.
Just
The
a
whole
sentence
paragraph,
or
yes,
the whole
yes.
paragraph?
Yes.
Yes.
So I read affirmations periodically. I think I want to be able to cut that out and just read that and let that be a prayer. It
Yes.
sounds so positive to me. Yes.
Yes. Print it out and hang it up on the wall and affirm it every day. Yes. For Christ is the Son of God who lives in his Creator and shines with his glory. Any other comments? Well, anything, Ed?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's go on then to section 5. The dynamics of the ego. No one can escape from illusions unless he looks at them, for not looking is the way they are protected. There is no need to shrink from illusions, for they cannot be dangerous. We are ready to look more closely at the ego's thought system because together we have the lamp that will dispel it. And since you realize you do not want it, you must be ready. Let us be very calm in doing this, for we are merely looking honestly for truth. The dynamics of the ego will be our lesson for a while, for we must look first at this to see beyond it, since you have made it real. We will undo this error quietly together and then look beyond it to truth. What is healing but the removal of all that stands in the way of knowledge? And how else can one dispel illusions except by looking at them directly without protecting them? Be not afraid, therefore, for what you will be looking at is the source of fear, and you are beginning to learn that fear is not real. You are also learning that its effects can be dispelled merely by denying their reality. The next step is obviously to recognize that what has no effects does not exist. Laws do not operate in a vacuum, and what leads to nothing has not happened. If reality is recognized by its extension, what leads to nothing could not be real. Do not be afraid then to look upon fear, for it cannot be seen. Clarity undoes confusion by definition, and to look upon darkness through light must dispel it. So we're starting now to get some clear instructions on how to deal with the ego. And we're being told right at the get-go that the ego isn't real, and so the ego is what creates fear, and fear isn't real, and that we dispel the darkness by shining the light on it, and light is knowledge, and darkness is fear and ego. So we just need to honestly look at the ego's thought system. Up in the first paragraph, it says, sentence 3, we are ready to look more closely at the ego's thought system because together we have the lamp, the light that will dispel it. Paragraph 3. Let us begin this lesson in ego dynamics by understanding that the term itself does not mean anything. It contains the very contradiction in terms that makes it meaningless. Dynamics implies the power to do something. And the whole separation fallacy lies in the belief that the ego has the power to do anything. The ego is fearful to you because you believe this. Yet the truth is very simple. All power is of God. What is not of him has no power to do anything. So the ego is a fiction that projects itself in fear and creates fear in our minds and creates the illusion of power. And yet we're being told that the only power is the power of God. And the ego is not real. It's an illusion. It does not exist, and it has no power. So sentence 6 and 7, all power is of God. What is not of him has no power to do anything. Once we wrap our mind around this concept, then we can go forth walking through the ego world with this knowledge and understanding and realize that the ego can't do anything to hurt us, that the ego has no power. And that is very liberating, which is what the Course is teaching us, how to liberate ourselves. Any questions, comments? Paragraph 4. When we look at the ego, then, we are not considering dynamics, but delusions. You can surely regard a delusional system without fear, for it cannot have any effects if its source is not real. Fear becomes more obviously inappropriate if you recognize the ego's goal, which is so clearly senseless that any effort on its behalf is necessarily expended on nothing. The ego's goal is quite explicitly ego autonomy. From the beginning, then, its purpose is to be separate, sufficient unto itself, and independent of any power except its own. This is why it is the symbol of separation. So the ego is delusional, it's insane, and it thinks it has power and that it can be powerful. But we're being told that's just not true. Paragraph 5. Every idea has a purpose, and its purpose is always the natural outcome of what it is. Everything that stems from the ego is the natural outcome of its central belief. And the way to undo its results is merely to recognize that their source is not natural, being out of accord with your true nature. I said before that to will contrary to God is wishful thinking and not real willing. His will is one because the extension of his will cannot be unlike itself. The real conflict you experience then is between the ego's idle wishes and the will of God, which you share. Can this be a real conflict? Well, no, it can't. It's just the illusion of a conflict. Paragraph 6. Yours is the independence of creation, not the autonomy. Your whole creative function lies in your complete dependence on God, whose function he shares with you. By his willingness to share it, he became as dependent on you as you are on him. Do not ascribe the ego's arrogance to him who wills not to be independent of you. He has included you in his autonomy. Can you believe that autonomy is meaningful apart from him? The belief in ego autonomy is costing you the knowledge of your dependence on God, in which your freedom lies. The ego sees all dependence as threatening and has twisted even your longing for God into a means of establishing itself. But do not be deceived by its interpretation of your conflict. Any questions, comments? The ego always attacks on behalf of separation. Believing it has the power to do this, it does nothing else, because its goal of autonomy is nothing else. The ego is totally confused about reality, but it does not lose sight of its goal. It is much more vigilant than you are, because it is perfectly certain of its purpose. You are confused because you do not recognize yours. You do not recognize your true purpose. And so you're still operating according to ego's purpose. Paragraph 8. You must recognize that the last thing the ego wishes you to realize is that you are afraid of it. For if the ego could give rise to fear, it would diminish your independence and weaken your power. Yet its one claim to your allegiance is that it can give power to you. Without this belief, you would not listen to it at all. How then can its existence continue if you realize that by accepting it, you are belittling yourself and depriving yourself of power? So that's the conundrum, the contradiction here. The ego trying to make you believe that it could give you the power, and yet believing that is what's diminishing your power. Paragraph 9. The ego can and does allow you to regard yourself as supercilious, unbelieving, lighthearted, distant, emotionally shallow, callous, uninvolved, and even desperate, but not really afraid, minimizing fear, but not its undoing, is the ego's constant effort, and is indeed a skill at which it is very ingenious. How can it preach separation without upholding it through fear? And would you listen to it if you recognize this as what it is doing? Well, no, you wouldn't listen to it if you recognize that it's just a game that it's playing and that it's not real. And that's what we're learning here. Paragraph 10. Your recognition that whatever seems to separate you from God is only fear, regardless of the form it takes, and quite apart from how the ego wants you to experience it, is therefore the basic ego threat. So the basic ego threat is that we're separated from God. And that builds up the fear. Its dream of autonomy is shaken to its foundation by this awareness. For though you may countenance a false idea of independence, you will not accept the cost of fear if you recognize it. Yet this is the cost, and the ego cannot minimize it. If you overlook love, you are overlooking yourself. And you must fear unreality because you have denied yourself. By believing that you have successfully attacked truth, you are believing that attack has power. Very simply, then, you have become afraid of yourself. And no one wants to find what he believes would destroy him. But that's what happens when we give in to the ego thinking. We just destroy ourselves. We become afraid of ourselves. Any questions, comments thus far? If the ego's goal of autonomy could be accomplished, God's purpose could be defeated. And this is impossible. Only by learning what fear is can you finally learn to distinguish the possible from the impossible and the false from the true. According to the ego's teaching, its goal can be accomplished and God's purpose cannot. According to the Holy Spirit's teaching, only God's purpose can be accomplished, and it is accomplished already. God is as dependent on you as you are on him, because his autonomy encompasses yours and is therefore incomplete without it. You can only establish your autonomy by identifying with him and fulfilling your function as it exists in truth. The ego believes that to accomplish its goal is happiness, but it is given you to know that God's function is yours, and happiness cannot be found apart from your joint will. Recognize only that the ego's goal, which you have pursued so diligently, has merely brought you fear, and it becomes difficult to maintain that fear is happiness. Upheld by fear, this is what the ego would have you believe. Yet God's Son is not insane and cannot believe it. Let him but recognize it, and he will not accept it. For only the insane would choose fear in place of love. And only the insane could believe that love can be gained by attack. But the sane realize that only attack could produce fear, from which the love of God completely protects them. So again, everything is exactly the reverse of what the ego wants you to think. Chapter 13. The ego analyzes, the Holy Spirit accepts. The appreciation of wholeness comes only through acceptance. For to analyze means to break down or to separate out. The attempt to understand totally by breaking it down is clearly the characteristically contradictory approach of the ego to everything. The ego believes that power, understanding, and truth lie in separation, and to establish this belief, it must attack. Unaware that the belief cannot be established, and obsessed with the conviction that separation is salvation, the ego attacks everything it perceives by breaking it into small, disconnected parts without meaningful relationships, and therefore without meaning. The ego will always substitute chaos for meaning. For if separation is salvation, harmony is threat. Any questions, comments? Ed? No. 14. The ego's interpretations of the laws of perception are, and would have to be, the exact opposite of the Holy Spirit's. The ego focuses on error and overlooks truth. It makes real every mistake it perceives, and with characteristically circular reasoning, concludes that because of the mistake, consistent truth must be meaningless. The next step then is obvious. If consistent truth is meaningless, inconsistency must be true. Holding error clearly in mind and protecting what it has made real, the ego proceeds to the next step in its thought system. Error is real and truth is error. Again, the exact opposite of spirit thinking. The ego makes no attempt to understand this, and it is clearly not understandable, but the ego does make every attempt to demonstrate it, and this it does constantly. Analyzing to attack meaning, the ego succeeds in overlooking it and is left with a series of fragmented perceptions which it unifies on behalf of itself. This then becomes the universe it perceives. And it is this universe which in turn becomes its demonstration of its own reality. All the bits and pieces of the universe that the ego created, always analyzing, separating, dividing into bits and pieces, trying to look for its own reality, but which it will never find. Paragraph 16. Do not underestimate the appeal of ego's demonstrations to those who would listen. Selective perception chooses its witnesses carefully, and its witnesses are consistent. The case for insanity is strong to the insane, for reasoning ends at its beginning, and no thought system transcends its source. Yet reasoning without meaning cannot demonstrate anything, and those who are convinced by it must be deluded. Can the ego teach truly when it overlooks truth? Can it perceive what it has denied? Its witnesses to attest to its denial, but hardly to what it has denied. The ego looks straight at the Father and does not see him, for it has denied his Son. And we see this in people who are so ingrained in ego thinking that they can't see the forest for the trees. They're constantly in a state of delusion. They're in a state of fear. They're afraid of this person and that person. They're afraid of this system and that system. They're just they persist in these ideas of hatred and violence, thinking that's going to liberate them, and they're just completely operating in insanity and delusion, but they don't see it because they're not looking at God. They're looking at ego. And if they're looking at ego, that's what they're going to see. And our job is to learn to look at God and not look at ego. Questions, comments?
I can see the ego in a whole lot of people, but it's hard to recognize it within myself. I sometimes can recognize it, but I think ego lives within me more than I really know. It's so easy to recognize it in other people. It's clear as a bell. It just feels differently when it's within.
Yes, thank you, Helen. You bring up a good point. And that's why we need to be vigilant to become aware of the signs of the ego thinking. So again, if we're condescending, we're being ego. If we're angry, we're being ego. If we're selfish, we're being ego. If we're
Judgmental,
hateful, lying, cheating, that's the thing. We have to be very vigilant on our thoughts, our actions, our deeds, and learn to recognize when ego is being manifested through us. And then once we recognize it, we have to stop and do just the opposite. So when somebody says something or something, and our immediate response is to be judgmental, oh, they're so stupid, they don't know what they're talking about. And then we realize that we had that thought and feeling, then we have to stop and say, no. They are a child of God as I am. The Spirit is within them as it is within me. We are one. I am you, I am them, and they are me. And I need to send them love and not judgment. So that's kind of like the process. And you just have to be very vigilant with your own thoughts and behavior and make the corrections one by one as they come up.
I agree. I think this is, and also that this is a really important chapter. As I feel this is a very important chapter because it's telling about the undoing.
Yes.
The undoing, because sometimes yeah, I guess that's all I have to say right now.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Did you have something, Ed? Okay. We've got 2 paragraphs left and our hour's almost up. So let's continue. We're on number 17. Would you remember the Father? Accept his Son, and you will remember him. Nothing can demonstrate that his Son is unworthy, or nothing can prove that a lie is true. What you see of his Son through the eyes of the ego is a demonstration that his Son does not exist. Yet where the Son is, the Father must be. Accept that God does not deny, and it will demonstrate its truth. I'm sorry, again, number 5. Accept what God does not deny, and it will demonstrate its truth. The witnesses for God stand in his light and behold what he created. Their silence is the sign that they have beheld God's Son, and in the presence of Christ, they need demonstrate nothing. For Christ speaks to them of himself and of his Father. They are silent because Christ speaks to them, and it is his words they speak. So to look at our brother and say, there is that of God within you, which is the Quaker way, is to acknowledge that the Father and the Son are one. And when we do that, and we acknowledge that for another person, we're doing it for ourselves because we are one with them. In the last paragraph, every brother you meet becomes a witness for Christ or for the ego, depending on what you perceive in him. Everyone convinces you of what you want to perceive and of the reality of the kingdom you have chosen for your vigilance. Everything you perceive is a witness to the thought system you want to be true. Every brother has the power to release you if you choose to be free. You cannot accept false witness of him unless you have evoked false witness against him. If he speaks not of Christ to you, you spoke not of Christ to him. You hear but your own voice, and if Christ speaks through you, you will hear him with a capital H. So that's the whole thing in a nutshell. Looking at everybody else as the Christ, you will see yourself as the Christ. And the Christ and the Father are one. Thus ends our lesson for tonight.
Thank you, John.
Comments? You're welcome. Comments, questions?
This really causes me to look inside. And it's teaching me to look forward in that way. So this is really good.
Yes, thank you, Ed. Well, okay then. If let's take a moment of silence and we'll end our recording for tonight.